Hello, English 20s. This is Mrs. Hishka, and I have a little review PowerPoint for you that I'd like to just walk you through. This is mostly review, but there are some new concepts in it as well. I want to talk today about the elements of fiction. Of course, that comprises the structure of the literature that we will study this year. First of all, we'll look at the plot, and many of you will remember the plot peak that you've been taught since about grade 7, and you will know the parts of it as well. The introduction, exposition, which sets the scene, tells us something about the characters, introduces conflict, and very often this can continue well into the story. You know that your setting is comprised of time, place, mood, and situation. The characters are classified as major, minor, round, flat, static, dynamic. We talk about the protagonist, the antagonist, and their relationships and their motivations. The major conflicts that you are familiar with: man versus nature or environment, and man versus self. The next part of the plot is the turning point, also called the initial incident. And it is that incident, that event, which catapults the protagonist into the conflict, and it is what gets the story going, so to speak. The next part we want to talk about is the rising action, and those are actual plot events that move us from the initial incident up to the climax of the story. And the rising action is always composed of a series of events. If the story is short, there might be a few events. If the story is long, there would be more events. And all of the rising action events lead us to the climax. And the climax is always the point at which the protagonist's conflict is resolved. So it is at that point that the protagonist wins or loses. Sometimes, but not always, it is the highest point of action, the most exciting part. But that is not always true. The rest of the story is comprised of the falling action and the denouement, or the resolution. Many answers come to pass in this section of the plot. Now, when you think about this, you think, oh, well, I know all of this. This is how a short story looks. But, this is true of a novel as well, that it has probably more than one of these peaks in it, but if you carefully examine it, it probably has the same basic structure. And then sometimes you see that the plot is reversed, that we start at the end, and we see what happens to the protagonist at the end of the story, or at the climax. And then the rest of the story is basically told in flashback. Well, if you carefully look at any story, any film, any novel, if you take it apart, you can probably rearrange those parts into a story structure that looks like this. Because this is a natural way to tell stories. Yes, we mix them up, we make them more complex, we lay 2 or 3 together so that we have 2 or 3 different plots that are running at the same time, a major one, a couple of minor ones. But in the end, when you take it apart, what you have is this plot peak. And you should be able to sort that out so you can see it quite easily. Of course, the plot are the actual events, those things that happen. We also talk a lot this year about the mood, the atmosphere, the tone. How do things seem? Every major work has a prevailing mood, but there can be shifts in mood as well. And sometimes it is that shift in mood or shift in tone that indicates to you that the story is heading off in a different direction. The protagonist has achieved some other revelation, and they are now going to follow that particular journey. Another term I'd like you to know is counterpoint. In literature, it is the art and technique of playing off complementary and opposing characters. Tone becomes a very important thing in English 20 because we are always trying to understand what's called subtext. What is underneath the actual story itself? And you know a lot of subtext already because you are able to read body language quite easily and you're able to read tone quite easily. Now something can be written one way, but the meaning is really different, and we know that because of the tone in which it's told. And here are a number of words that can be used to describe tone. The narrator, there's several different types of narrators. The narrator is, of course, the person who tells the story and establishes the point of view. You should not confuse the narrator and the author. They are different. They do not have to have the same attitudes towards anything. The major narration patterns that you'll see, first person major, very common. The main character tells the story. Third person omniscient is also very common, where we know the thoughts of all the people in the story. Limited omniscient, where we know the thoughts of one character, and this person reports to us about what other people are doing. There is the objective narrator, where the narrator reports only what he or she sees, and the first person minor narration, that's told through a minor character in the story. That would be something like the Sherlock Holmes stories, whereby Dr. Watson tells the story. I want you to think about other ways that narrators are looked at in literature. First of all, the narrators that you're most familiar with are reliable narrators. This one reports perceptions close to that of the author. We feel we can trust the word of the narrator. We tend to trust narrators. Maybe we shouldn't, but we do. We feel that if they're telling us the story, then we need to know what they think and we need to be able to trust them. But this year, we're going to look at some unreliable narrators. It is an ironic narrative approach, for it involves a discrepancy between what is said and what is meant. And the last kind of narration that we'll talk about this year is the naive narrator. Often a child, sometimes a mentally or experientially impaired adult whose perception and interpretation of events is limited by lack of experience. And you read a story last year in grade 10 that had a naive narrator in it, and that would be To Kill a Mockingbird. Scout is a naive narrator. Her understanding of the situation in Macomb, Alabama grows as she ages and as she has experiences. The theme in any story is a central and dominating idea. It is the message that the author wishes to convey. It's not a lesson and it's not a moral, and it should not be phrased as such. This year that you will learn how to write theme statements. They'll be 4 to 6 sentences in length, and they will try to present the theme of the story. Conflict types, you're very familiar with that. I'll just let you read them. You've been learning about this since about grade 3, so I'm sure you're very familiar with it. Character types, again, You are very familiar with this. You know that round characters are three-dimensional, and they're usually pretty realistic because we know a lot about them. We know their psychological, their emotional makeup, their something about their intellect. All of this is contributes to the realism of the character. Other types of characters are flat. There's the one-dimensional. Very often, characters in stories are not very highly developed. In novels, they tend to be more highly developed because the author has more time. But in a short story, some of the characters just don't get that level of development. Then, of course, there's the stock characters, and you're familiar with these stereotypical characters. There's the light-headed blonde, the town drunk, the dumb jock, the burly Irish policeman, the nagging mother-in-law. All of them have perhaps some element of truth to them, but they are flawed because they are stereotypical. The character foil is a character that's designed specifically to highlight a specific trait of a different character. Lisa and Bart in The Simpsons are foils of each other. Here's something new for you, is the archetypal character. They're ideals that are ingrained into our culture, and they keep reappearing over and over. And, of course, we have the original type or model. It's a prototype. You might be familiar with prototypes that car companies put out of brand new concept cars. Well, the same thing happens in literature. For example, horror stories, Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are all archetypal characters. The hero is also an archetypal character. We have Superman, Batman, Gladiator in a more modern genre. So an archetypal character is an ideal example or a type. It's a perfect example, so to speak. We also talk about how characters change. They can be static, which means they don't change, and dynamic, which means they do change. I want to review some of the techniques and devices. You know about flashback and foreshadowing and symbols. And you know that there's different kinds of endings, happy, unhappy, or surprise endings. Endings can also be ambivalent with no real resolution. And sadly for you, we are sort of getting into a stage where a lot of our stories have ambivalent endings. And a lot of endings are not happy endings or surprise endings. And I know that those appeal to you, but the literature that we study is going to be much more lifelike and more realistic, and life rarely has very precise endings to anything. Life is more likely to be ambivalent, and things just drift off, and you don't always know how anything ends. Probably the most important technique or device that we're going to study this year is irony. Irony is the subtext that I want you to focus on this year. I want you to be aware of it, and I want you to be looking for it all the time. It is a device of contrast or incongruity. Verbal irony, say one thing, mean another. There's dramatic irony. This contrast is between what we as reader or viewer knows and what the characters know. Oh, you know this in horror stories, movies. The girl is downstairs, she's by herself. The mad, crazed Axeman is upstairs in the attic waiting to kill her. And she hears something and she starts going up the stairs. Now, you and I, as the viewer or the reader, we know who's upstairs in the attic, but she doesn't. And so the irony is that she is going into something that we know about already. Situational irony, and the discrepancy is between appearance and reality, between what appears to be so and what actually is so. And when we get to studying our Shakespearean play this year, which is Macbeth, we will find that it is full of situational irony. It's also full of dramatic irony, for that matter. You read To Kill a Mockingbird last year, and at the end we find that Boo saves the children rather than harms them. This is ironic for both Scout and the reader. Thank you for going through this review with me. You will find this PowerPoint on a Moodle and on my Weebly, and you can review it as you wish if you don't wish to listen to my voice talk you through it.